So I wanted to include for this week that also the initial idea of the New Deal. So the New Deal is FDR's reaction to the Great Depression, and this part of the New Deal kind of lecture is going to focus primarily on the programs, not really so much on the controversies. The controversies will be the last thing, and we'll kind of discuss that later on. So the big thing are the most significant pieces of legislation. Remember, he states very clearly in his inaugural address that he's going to address economic concerns. And you're going to see that really kind of take hold because, as I mentioned before, after the 32 election in November, people begin to rush to the banks. You have a series of bank panics, largely because people know that FDR is going to take us off the gold standard, that we're going to go on money that's based on exchange rates and interest rates, not based on that kind of hard currency gold supply. So it kind of causes everybody to freak out. And so that kind of adds to the issues. You have some states declaring bank holidays. Basically, that means the banks are closed for a couple of days to get everybody to calm down, to stop this panic from happening. You'll have FDR using a national bank holiday to also create confidence in the banks, to secure that the banks are definitely safe. This shows you kind of what a bank panic looks like. And so this New Deal is not a single particular phase or a single particular program, rather. It's a variety of programs. It's a whole collection. And it's really about trying to get results. There's two phases to this. Now, this won't make, we tend to want to think of it in terms of presidential elections. So the 1932 presidential election, the 1936 presidential election, the 1940 presidential election. All of those FDR wins, and all of those are taking place during this New Deal. But we kind of break it apart really by the midterm elections. So you've got one phase, the first New Deal, that happens, this new Congress that's rushed in 1932. They are in charge from 33 and 34. You'll have another Congress that comes in after the 34 election for 35 and 36. And so you have a second New Deal. Once you get to 1938, things are heating up kind of globally. FDR is they're kind of not really bringing in new things. They're kind of tweaking the old ones. So you really just have the two New Deals. And again, they're more tied specifically to kind of the first half of FDR's first term as president, the second half into a little bit of his second term as president. And we'll talk on the next section when we talk about the controversies related to FDR. The controversies that have to do with his agenda and how that kind of slows down the New Deal. And of course, he seeks a lot of advice, a lot of advisors. And his big point is that this is not about revolution. We're not trying to undo the U.S. government. We're not trying to be anti-democratic. However, we are trying to evolve, right? The government's supposed to evolve and change with modern times. Again, you're having this kind of basically redone for sorry, I guess got a weird email. So basically redone, for the modern period, this progressive era has come back for people. So that's absolutely what that cartoon is talking about. One of the things, I don't know if you remember when President Trump took office, there's a lot of noise. What have you done in the first 100 days? This is where that idea comes from, that a president has to have a bold agenda for the first 100 days. Because in FDR's first 100 days, you basically have 15 major pieces of legislation that are passed. And FDR begins the process early in his presidency of using the fireside chats, of using the radio to communicate directly with the American people. This is the agenda I have. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. This is what we're hoping will happen, or this particular program didn't work out as well, so we're going to change it. So he's using the fireside chat as a way to directly connect with people. And so that's new, kind of the use of the radio, as well as kind of this persistent action, this swirl of activity that happens in the first few months of his presidency. Of course, we've already looked at his inaugural address. One of the first things that happens after he's inaugurated in March, it will be because of the Great Depression that after 1933, the inauguration takes place in January, largely because that bank holiday or the bank panics that happened after the election made everyone realize that we don't need to wait for 3 months. We don't need to have that long of a lame duck period. So as soon as he takes the oath of office in March, you have him declaring a national bank holiday to give people a week to kind of calm down. And he creates the Emergency Banking Relief Act. What that means is that Treasury officers go around and investigate the banks. They make sure the banks are sound. And then on March 12th, he basically says, hey, the banks are safe. If the bad banks, they've been shut down. The healthy banks are in place. Banks that had some issues, we have people running them. The government's in charge, right? And it increases confidence, and you have people rushing to put deposits back into the bank. So it's a good thing, right? The Emergency Banking Relief Act that kind of creates this idea that the government monitors the banks and makes sure that they're healthy. The next one is going to be in April 33. We go off the gold standard, so we can have deficit spending. The Glass-Steagall Act separates those commercial banks from investment banks. So that way banks can no longer invest in the stock market. They can't use your deposit for stock purchases unless you know that's the kind of account that it is. So they still have those accounts, but they are not. They have to be very upfront with them. And the most important, of course, is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guarantees our deposits in the bank, so we never have to worry about a bank closing and our money disappearing. Creates faith and security in the money system. Securities and Exchange Act, truthful information to investors. They can't doctor their books. They can't pretend that their companies are healthier. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, creates rules and regulations about how you buy and sell stocks. You can't do insider trading, that kind of thing. So he's got an immediate kind of bank relief program. Then you're going to have him going into jobs and relief. So you've got one has to do with reform. That's the banking reforms, right? That we're essentially going to, monitor the banks, clean up things, get rid of the corruption. Now you're getting into the relief part of the New Deal. The relief programs are about putting money in people's hands. And they do this in a couple of different ways. Some of it is through direct relief. Here's money, you're unemployed, participate in the economy. But the favorite way is for jobs programs. These are things that provide people work and they get paid. One of the most famous ones is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, takes young men. Now, these are white men because they will live in kind of barracks, right? So because it's the 1930s and we have segregation, African-American men can't participate, but lots of young white men can take advantage of this. And so it takes young guys who maybe don't have a job. They can go work with the Forest Service. They have a place to live. Their food is provided. Their clothes are provided. They get paid $30 a month that they then can send home to mom and dad, right, to help mom and dad pay bills, or they can, spend it or something like that. So CCC kind of takes those young single men, again, heavier on, men and on white men, but it does build a lot of roadside parks, a lot of takes care of the forest, that kind of thing. The next one is going to be the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. FERA is the big umbrella. Underneath FERA is going to come two major programs, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, and the Civil Works Administration, the CWA. This is about providing money to local governments, right? So you would have a PWA or a CWA project, and the federal government would spend money for this project in your area. Now, the difference between the PWA and the CWA is the PWA uses construction companies. In other words, they decide they're going to build a school or, build a new waterworks system, and they would contract out and they would tell that contractor, hey, you have to hire this many African Americans. Here's money for you to pay your workers. So you have kind of an intermediary. The government hires somebody and that person then hires other people. With the CWA, it's very different. The government hires the workers directly, and these are smaller, more temporary kind of construction projects. projects. And basically, they're building playgrounds and schools and roads and parks and all that kind of stuff. Again, the government is the direct employer. CWA burns through a ton of money. It's incredibly expensive. In fact, FDR will shut down the CWA after about a year. But it does kind of help get people through that winter of 33 and 34. So it's a short-term program. The PWA, however, will be around for a really long time. Another relief program is the Homeowners Loan Corporation that will help people restructure their mortgage payments. So it's meant to help homeowners. It can be pretty helpful. Now, it tends to only help people who are, aren't about to be foreclosed on. I mean, there's a point at which it's too late to help you. But it does help some people stay in their homes because they can refinance. We had a similar thing after the 2008 recession that was called the Mortgage Assistance Program. So this allows people to restructure loans, if you will. Particularly home loans. The next big public works program is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This creates, again, is a major dam hydroelectric program throughout the Tennessee Valley to help control floods and provide electricity to the rural South. You had large areas of the South that did not have electricity. The TVA will begin to change that, as will the Rural Electrification Administration. And they will employ a ton of workers and directly affect these southern states, providing this massive series of hydroelectric dams. So the TVA is a huge jobs program, really changes the South in a lot of different ways. There's ecological costs with that, but for the most part, people see the TVA as a very important, massive kind of government, monopoly, essentially, over electricity providing. Now, eventually, the TVA becomes privatized, but for probably about 15 years, it was a government-run electricity organization. The next one is about recovery, trying to help the economy recover. So you have reform with banking, you have relief with jobs and money to people. Now you have recovery to help fix the industry. This is the National Industrial Recovery Act, creates the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. And they essentially create a series where they suspend some antitrust laws and they encourage price cooperation. We're going to all agree on how much we're going to charge for this item. We're all going to agree on how much we're going to pay for wages. And in exchange for participating with kind of this cooperation, then the government would give participating industries and businesses posters and stamps and things that they could use in their advertising to communicate to people that you want to buy here because we're participating with the government. We're working with FDR to fix the economy. One of the big problems, though, with this is it's very inefficient. A lot of these wage and price controls are set by big companies, not small companies. And it ultimately ends up not being super popular. A lot of companies don't feel like it's very effective. They feel like they're not being able to protect function like a business anymore. The Supreme Court will declare the NRA unconstitutional, say that the government cannot force businesses, tell them what they can charge, they cannot control wages like that. But this shows you what I mean by the posters. You put the poster, on the window. People would see it. Oh, hey, I want to shop at this grocery store. They participate with the NRA in setting their wages, right? And so it was a way of getting people to buy into a particular type of system. But like I said, it's horribly inefficient. It tends to favor only certain companies. And when it's declared unconstitutional, this is going to trigger some frustration with FDR, which we'll talk about in the next section, where he gets kind of mad at the Supreme Court, if you will, and takes tries to pack the court, which I'll give you some more details later. But the NRA is definitely kind of one of these organizations meant to recover the economy, but doesn't quite do so. The other one that's meant to recover the economy is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And essentially, in a nutshell, it pays farmers not to produce. It pulls out kind of the old sub-treasury plan by the populists had talked about. Unfortunately, they organize it kind of late. The farmers end up destroying a bunch of crops and all that kind of stuff. And kind of like with the NRA, it's the large farms, the large commercial farms that benefit more than the small family farms. And it certainly affects sharecroppers pretty badly because a landowner would get money from the government not to plant something. So he would tell his sharecroppers, thanks, but no thanks. We'll see you later. And then those people would be unemployed. So again, it's not really a very fair system. It's kind of seen as too much control of the economy. So these two recovery methods are actually declared unconstitutional and are kind of rejected by the Supreme Court. We end up kind of doing a series of smaller acts, a little more targeted acts to kind of help strengthen unions, help provide subsidies for farmers, those kinds of things. The subsidy that Trump is using to buy up soybean right now is a Great Depression era subsidy that was put in place. So you've got some things like that. So you want to kind of generally know that these are recovery pieces of legislation. One's for industry, one's for farms. They're both declared unconstitutional. They both tended to favor large entities, not small ones, and were largely seen as an overreach. Also happening by 1934 is a lot of critics. These are critics that say that FDR is not going far enough. You have a guy by the name of Huey Long from Louisiana who says, we need to have a limit on how much people can make. Anything over this goes back, everyone has a guaranteed basic income. This idea of a chicken in every pot. He calls it share our wealth. Another one was Father Coughlin, is a priest that calls on a radio show, The Power of Radio again, talking about nationalized banks and really heavy taxes on the wealthy. And then lastly, a guy by the name of Dr. Townsend, who says that we can decrease unemployment if we give a guaranteed pension to people over the age of 60. And then people over the age of 60 would have money so they could participate in the economy. And yet they would not have to work, and that would open up jobs for younger people. And if that sounds familiar, that is largely because it is the kind of the Social Security plan. So Father Coughlin on the left, Huey Long on the right, and an advertisement for the Townsend plan. So after the 1934 midterms, you have what is called the Second New Deal. They have another attempt at having a major pieces of legislation passed. They don't quite pass as many pieces of legislation, but you do have some significant ones. Things like the Works Progress Administration is created. The WPA is different from the PWA. The PWA is strictly buildings and infrastructure. The WPA includes art, includes music, includes recording slave histories, so it has these kind of traditional public works, but then it also has this more creative side to it. So if you go to Fair Park during the state fair, you'll see all those murals on the buildings. Those are WPA. Fair Park is a WPA program. Those buildings, those murals were all done during this period. So whenever you see a WPA building, there tends to be some kind of artistic element to it because they were hiring artists and writers and intellectuals and teachers and journalists and all this kind of stuff, photojournalists, right? To try to put people to work and make sure people at all levels are participating in the economy. Then they also do the Wagner Act in 1935. This is kind of a response to the declaring the NRA unconstitutional. So they basically allow workers to organize. In other words, the government can't set the wages, but the workers can negotiate for wages. And by creating a National Labor Relations Board, you have the government basically throwing its muscle behind the workers. This is very different than what we saw in the Gilded Age, where the government threw its muscle behind the business owners. Now the government throws its muscle the other direction and really kind of encourages business owners and companies to come to the bargaining table and to create arbitration that helps kind of level out and kind of let workers negotiate for better wages. And so you have the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, in part because Henry Ford is not wanting to cooperate much, and they have a sit-down strike, and you have FDR kind of forcing Ford to kind of come to terms. The last big one that I want to talk about is the Social Security Act, 1935. This one's hugely significant, underscore significant. It affects our lives today. All of us have Social Security taxes taken out of our paycheck. And the principle behind this is that they force us to contribute in advance so that when we get retirement age, we can collect benefits, right? We have a pension. So it's not an entitlement. It's not a handout. This is something we already pay for. We pay in advance for our Social Security checks. Now, there's some issues that I'll talk about here in a second. But fundamentally, the Social Security Act is meant to provide financial security for the elderly and for the unemployed, also for children whose parents have passed away. It helps keep them from falling, not having any resources. And this is the one that, of course, we still have with us today. Most people really like. And so people are paying into it. Again, it's not a charity. It's not an entitlement. Now, the big problem, of course, is that we don't anticipate changes in population like the baby boom after World War II, where you end up having a really huge generation that is outsized to the generations that are paying in. So right now, we've got all these baby boomers who are retirement age, collecting Social Security, not working and paying into it anymore. And there's not enough of us who are working. So you got a problem there. They let some Congresses kind of change make it easier for people to withdraw. They had some Congresses that made it where they kind of used it as collateral for borrowing. So there's some issues with Social Security, but fundamentally, Social Security is a guaranteed program. They can't just do away with Social Security because then they have to refund all of us our money, right, that we've paid into it, or default, in which case we don't have much of a government, right? The big thing about Social Security is it establishes the idea that the federal government should be responsible for people who cannot work. So if you're elderly, if you're disabled, if you're unemployed, if you're a child who's been orphaned, the government steps in and helps take care of you so that you are not left vulnerable. And again, they sell it basically as, old age security, kind of security for your family. Lots of effort to kind of make sure people see it as such. So there's a lot of misinformation about Social Security these days, but I think those are kind of the big ones. And again, it really kind of shapes who we are today. Last reforms that are passed, the National Housing Act tries to help poor people buy homes, and they create the Housing Authority, provides low-income housing. Now, one of the problems with the Housing Authority is it does kind of permit some what we call redlining, which made it hard for African Americans to buy houses. But it is an attempt to kind of make sure that poor people could buy homes that would not have to worry, have low interest loans, right? So people that, didn't have money to start with. So the HOLC tended to help the middle class. This helps the other end of the spectrum. You also have the Farm Security Administration, helps tenant farmers purchase farms, meant to help resolve the fact that one of the unintended consequences of the AAA was that a lot of tenant farmers got kicked off their farms. So this is meant to kind of help people do that. You have the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This ends some of the working conditions, puts in protections for workers, ends child labor, creates the 40-hour work week. These are things that have been created under the NRA as part of the agreement to participate. But when that's declared unconstitutional, they have to come back and they have to basically legislate these particular aspects of it. So you can thank the Fair Labor Standards Act for mostly for the work world in which we all live in, right? But the problem in 1938 is you have an election, and we'll talk in the next section about how FDR kind of squanders his political power on a Supreme Court packing scheme because he's mad about the NRA and the AAA. We'll also see that there's some frustration because the economy is not improved, right? We actually have a recession within a depression. They start taking Social Security taxes out, which means people have less money to spend, and that makes people frustrated. And so there's kind of a backlash against FDR. Now, make no mistake, he still has a majority. He still, he himself is very popular, but you have more Republicans coming into Congress. And so you begin to have a little bit more of a divided government. And this allows the Republicans to kind of slow down the process, right? They The Democrats don't have the huge majority that they had before. And so this slows down the reforms, right? And so you have that as an issue. You also have the conservative Democrats, the racist ones, the ones that don't like African Americans, being able to leave the tenant farms or being able to buy their own land. So they're going to start to be frustrated. And part of this has to do with Eleanor and her reaching out to African Americans. So there's some complexities to this that we'll talk about in the next section. And I think I'll do that face to face. But this will kind of give you an idea that by 1938, in that midterm election, Republicans gain enough seats that they slow down the reform process. So you also have by 1938 a series of events happening in Europe that begin to really distract FDR and make him put his efforts towards getting prepared for kind of global issues. So that is kind of it for kind of the nuts and bolts of the New Deal. Again, you have reform, relief, and recovery, those 3 R's. And, you want to know kind of the banking stuff. You want to know the jobs and relief programs. And then you want to kind of know the big ones that were kicked out, the NRA and the AAA. And you absolutely need to be familiar with the Social Security Act. So like I said, I think I'll stop for here. I think that'll be enough for this week. And then we'll finish up kind of face to face and discuss some of the struggles that FDR had in trying to push through his New Deal.